really appreciate you all taking the time out of your days for this, especially the committee that's going to be serving on this and helping us think through some of these challenges that we have, right? I want to stress, however, that I felt like, we couldn't wait very much longer for this process. Things are going by pretty quickly. This is one of the first things that staff brought to me when I came into the office, and I really want to ensure that changes are in place, ready for the 2023 municipal elections. In terms of timing, Denver charter has not been updated to reflect the changes in state and federal election laws over the past 10 years, including the move to mail ballot elections in 2013. Quite honestly, if I can just share, the charter should have been amended years ago. And my office should not have been forced to conduct the 2019 municipal elections on such a short timeline. But thanks to our team and thanks to the ability for us to be able to pivot, on a dime, that we're able to do that without getting in any kind of violation with the state. But we've gotten close though, right? And so we need to do this early enough to communicate the change to Denver voters and the community in general so that no one is caught off guard in 2023. As always, we're focused on this election coming up here, November 2020. I hope you all are registered to vote, have updated your information, and are planning on, filling that mail ballot in and turning it in on time and helping us spread the word that here in Denver, we can do that by mail. And it's a great system, it's safe, it's secure. And so, those of you who are on the call right now, you make sure if you can help us be messengers for that. We actually have it good. We need to kind of flex a little bit and show off that muscle, but just also to make sure that people understand what they got going on here in Colorado. By convening this particular committee, however, I am to study potential solutions. We want to hear from policy experts, solicit public feedback, and recommend a path forward for Denver's elections in the future. Now, like I said, we wanted to make sure that we had broad community participation. Unfortunately, because of COVID, it's forcing us to do this online. However, hats off to our team with Andy and Dan, just the whole team to be able to do this online. You're going to hear today from our elections director, Jocelyn Baccaro, about the types of issues that we ran into in 2019. As you know, I was your clerk starting in July, right after the muni elections. So, I wasn't paying attention as closely as they are to it. Now, however, we have that opportunity to make those changes, right? You're also going to hear from our state demographer, and that's because I want you all to be cognizant of our voters' efficacy under the proposed solutions. Right now, our council actually does reflect the demographics of the city, and I don't want to inadvertently break that up, right? So we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to make sure that folks have representation in this city. The other thing is, just to wrap up, this committee is going to be tasked with recommending possible charter changes to modernize Denver's election municipal cycle. The other thing I want to make clear is that they should aim to solve the conflict between Denver's municipal election timeline and state and federal requirements. That's what prompted us to be able to do this. And now that we're doing this, we want to also explore other opportunities to modernize and make more efficient. This is also a natural reflection point for us about the wisdom of the runoff election requirement and also, the timing, right? The popular question has always been, why have a May election when we can have it in November, right? So we will be analyzing all of those questions and all of those different policy recommendations and, and hopefully, that's why we're partnering with City Council because we'd like this to translate into legislative action, right? So whatever those decisions come out of this process, we want to make sure that we have enough public input so that council can make an informed decision and the mayor can make an informed decision. We all can get there as a city. I look forward to our discussions in the next few months. And again, I appreciate your time and your diligence in helping us find solutions for our municipal elections. And keep an open mind, right? We're going to hear a lot of different ideas, and I want to make sure that we're doing that. So let me introduce our committee members. I'm going to start with Michael Cummings. Professor Cummings it comes out of the political science department out of the University of Colorado at Denver. I was a Buff when it was still Buffs. I don't know about all this Lynx stuff, but I was UCD when they were Buffaloes. So proud of our former department chair, Professor Emeritus now. My old colleague, Councilman Kevin Flynn, who represents the highest point, as he puts it, in Denver District 2. Kevin, wave for everybody. We also will have the Honorable Stacy Gilmore, who now serves as the president of Council District 11. She represents the northeast part of Denver, as she puts it, Denver's front door. Mr. Mark Gruskin, Esquire. Mark is definitely an expert in this realm. He's seen campaigns come and go from state and muni side to issue committee politics to really being able to have a good grasp and just a great knowledge bank on elections and elections policy. So I really want to make sure that we welcome Mark as well too, as shareholder with Wright Cornfield. Our former clerk and recorder, the first elected clerk and recorder for Denver, the Honorable Stephanie O'Malley. She is now the Associate Vice Chancellor for Government and Community Relations over at DU. Gina Ozels, who's also a field director for COLOR, so the Colorado Organization for Latina Opportunity and Reproductive Rights. Gina brings a lot of on-the-ground grassroots experience, you know, working with different campaigns on the ground, and also being somebody who's engaged with our young people in areas where we have a lot of people of color. And also, finally, last but not least, Mr. Alan Salazar, who serves as the Chief of Staff for Mayor Michael Hancock. And those of us who knew Alan before he served as Chief of Staff for the mayor know that he is definitely a name in the political realm in terms of elections and kind of politics, and being that expert in Colorado politics and policy over the years. So thank you all, committee members. You know, I want to make sure that folks understand that, you know, we worked really hard to appoint these committee members, to make sure that we had folks that did have, you know, an open mind and that understood policy in Denver and are able to hear from you all, right? So we want folks to be able to have a lot of different input, and we want to make sure that that's meaningful input and that's input that we can take and transform into policy. Again, the goal is to get out of the woods with any kind of legal issues that we have in terms of timing, but also taking this opportunity to really look at how we can really make Denver, we can modernize our municipal elections. So I'll leave the rest with Dan. Dan Volkosh serves as my policy and not engagement, I'm sorry. He is engaged, but he serves with policy in our city clerk division and also with compliance, right? So I will pass it over to Dan. Any questions? And then we'll pass it over to Dan.
Hola.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Clerk. So I would like to go over both, or the meeting mechanics, the goal, and the timeline of this committee. So we'll just start with the mechanics first. We ask that only members of the committee ask questions after presentations, because we only did schedule this for 90 minutes. All comments from the public, if you want to make a comment, can be emailed to charterclerk@denvergov.org. This is an email address we created specifically for this process, and we plan on taking public comment throughout the entirety of this process. So what we're going to do is actually forward every public comment that we get to the committee members before each meeting. Like I said before, all meetings will be recorded and added to the committee's webpage so people can view them at any time. And again, we just ask that you put yourself on mute when you are not speaking so we avoid a little bit of feedback. All right. So moving on to the goal of this committee. Ultimately, what we would like to see is the committee recommend a solution for the current situation. Great music. So as we see it, the potential options are the following. You could recommend to us that we pursue a different voting model, something like plurality or first past the post, ranked choice or approval voting. You could also recommend that we just provide more time in between the two elections, the municipal general and the runoff election. And you could recommend that we move the election dates in conjunction with any one of those options. Now, if you're sitting here and you're saying, I don't know exactly what approval voting is versus ranked choice versus plurality, that's okay. We are dedicating all of the future meetings to each one of these options. So you will see when we get the meeting agendas in front of you, there will be one meeting to educate you about ranked choice, about approval, about plurality, as opposed to those other two. We are also going to have other municipal clerks speak to their experience when they moved from a April or May election to November and coordinated with state elections. So by the end of this process, the committee members, we think will have hopefully a very educated recommendation for us to pursue for November. And ultimately that is the goal. We would like to see a charter amendment in front of Denver voters if we need to amend the charter in November of 2021. So we think that is a good timeline and that it gives us enough time to educate our voters and communicate with our voters about the changes if voters approve those changes in November. Additionally, any recommendation that the committee makes will have what I call kind of side effects with a lot of other charter provisions. So you, the committee members are allowed to make any other recommendations that they see fit for the charter. And you know, a good example of that is what you're actually going to hear today from our elections director about things like the candidate petition deadline. That's really early. Okay. We are tentatively scheduled for 6 meetings, this being the first of 6. And so we are in August 20th, September 17th, and then we're actually going to take a break in October and November. And this is so our fantastic elections team can run the best election that the city has ever seen for the 2020 presidential election. And then we will pick that back up in December. And then we'll have 2 in January and 1 in February. That February meeting is right now scheduled to be the last meeting. And then once that recommendation is formed after the February meeting, then the work is going to transition to us a little bit to work with the mayor's office, with the city council, and to work on implementing charter amendments to get them onto the ballot in November of 2021. All right. So next, I'm going to hand this over to our Director of Communications and Community Engagement, Grace Ramirez, who will walk you through the communications plan for this committee.
Thanks, Dan. Next slide, please. You can skip my little bio. As Dan mentioned, public comment is absolutely super important for us throughout this 6-month process. We want to make sure that we're engaging our community across the city to get feedback on this. And we're really focusing on using that email address, charterclerk@denvergov.org, to receive this public comment. Essentially, it's because we want to make sure that we're tracking where the comments are coming from, that we're reaching every residents in every single city council district, and that we really are getting feedback citywide. So in addition to, again, the email, I know that obviously we just reviewed the 6-month meeting schedule. As Dan already mentioned, these meetings will be recorded and available on our charter review website as soon as the meeting is over, as quickly as we can get them up there by the end of the day. We are also promoting these monthly meetings via boosted social media, as well as emailing our stakeholder lists well before the meeting, to ensure that folks are aware that it's on their calendar if they plan on attending, and reminding them that the meetings will be recorded each month and available up on our website. And that's again via Zoom. The Zoom link is already on our website now, as you all may have seen. And again, the recorded meetings will be available monthly for community to review. And then in addition to that, we'll be focusing on doing presentations to community and advocacy groups through the fall and into the spring. We'll be reaching out to a number of the stakeholder groups to make sure that we're getting in front of as many people as possible, and obviously tracking each of those presentations, the amount of people that come to the presentations, as well as the amount of community that join us monthly in the monthly meetings. We can also track how many people are accessing the recorded meeting afterwards as well. So those are all data points that we'll be tracking to ensure that we have thorough community feedback. Beyond that, of course, we are doing media outreach. We did send out a media release regarding this committee. We are following up with our contacts in media that focus on this beat at Denverite, Denver Post, and other online publications to help us amplify the information that we're discussing here in this committee. And then finally, in the spring, we will be doing a larger public meeting, which we'll be promoting in a much bigger way, and looking to do also a community survey in the spring as well. Any questions? Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. So just before we turn this over to Elections Director Bucaro, we just wanted to put three things really at the top of your mind regarding the charter requirements that we have. So the first one is that Charter Provision 8.2.7 requires candidate petitions to be returned into the elections office 55 days before the day of the election. The general municipal is required to be held on the first Tuesday in May of odd-numbered years. And for the runoff election, if necessary, it shall be held on the first Tuesday in June, so roughly about 1 month or 30 days afterwards, after the general municipal election. So with that, it'll be my pleasure to turn this over to Jocelyn Bucaro, who is our Elections Director. She joined us from Butler County, Ohio, after serving as the Director and Deputy Director there, and she joined our office in 2018. Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot to mute. Thank you, Andy, for advancing to the next slide as well. And thank you all for this opportunity to present, and thank you especially to the committee members for serving in this important way. As the clerk noted, Denver's municipal election model is in need of updating. As the Director of Elections, and after surviving, for that's the right word to use, the municipal election cycle of 2019, I'm here today to present to you the difficulty and risks that we face administering elections under this current model, and the obstacles and burden that it places on our voters. As a nationally and internationally recognized and award-winning election operation, the Denver Elections Division prides itself on being voter-centric. We have worked diligently for years to provide the best possible customer service through innovative solutions. We pioneered ballot tracking and notification for voters with Ballot Trace. We pioneered in the state of Colorado an accessible vote at home option for voters with disabilities. We have one-stop shopping for ballot research with an interactive and accessible sample ballot on our website. We offer ballot materials in 7 languages, including 5 not required by state or federal law. And we piloted a mobile voting application in 2019 that enabled military and overseas voters the convenience of receiving, marking, and casting their ballots from their mobile device. We understand customer service and the needs of our voters, and I'm here to ask for your help in making our municipal election model more service-friendly to enable more voters to participate. Next slide, please. So let's walk through again our current model. As you saw in the charter language, the municipal general election is held on the first Tuesday in May every 4 years. A runoff election must be held if no candidate receives more than 50% of the vote in the general election. The exception to this is at-large council seats for which the top 2 vote getters in the general election are declared the winners. The runoff election is then held the first Tuesday in June. In 2019, that date fell exactly 4 weeks after the municipal general election, which is the tightest window under which the runoff can fall following the municipal general election under calendars. It's also important to point out that in 2019, Denver had 420,000 active voters eligible to automatically receive ballots by mail in the municipal general election, and slightly less than that in the runoff election. As the clerk mentioned, several important state and federal laws have been changed over the last 10 years that have impacted the administration of our municipal election. In that time, the charter has unfortunately not been updated to reflect or accommodate some of those changes. So let's walk through what those were. Next slide. First, in 2010, the Federal MOVE Act was passed. This bill, among other things, requires that military and overseas ballots, also referred to as UOCAVA, for Uniformed Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act, be transmitted to those eligible voters 45 days before federal elections. This bill also requires election officials offer to electronically transmit a ballot to a qualified voter under UOCAVA beginning the 45th day. I'm mentioning that only because I will be touching on the impact of that in just a bit. Denver has approximately 3,500 active UOCAVA voters. And of those, approximately 800 to 900, it varies, receive their ballots by mail. State law was then updated in 2011 to require the 45-day mailing window for all elections covered under Title 1-8.3-103, if you want the exact citation. And that specific aspect of Title I refers also to covering any election coordinated by the county clerk and recorder. It's important to note that the reason for that law, updated both in the federal and state, in both federal and state requirements requiring that 45-day mailing window, was passed because lawmakers understood the burdens facing active duty military and overseas citizens in receiving postal mail and transmitting mail back to the states. Under federal law, that 45-day mailing window and electronic transmission is required only for transmitting the ballot to the voter. States have different requirements as to how voters can return those ballots to the election office. Colorado is fortunate because we also permit the electronic return. But as I mentioned, we have about 800 to 900 voters who do choose to get their ballots by mail, which they're eligible to do under that law. It's also important to note that both the federal and state law received wide bipartisan support. Finally, Colorado, as you all know, moved to a vote by mail election model in 2013 when House Bill 1303 passed. Under this model, all active domestic voters, meaning not UOCAVA voters, must be mailed ballots between 22 and 18 days before any election covered under 1-8.3.103, which, as I referred to above, includes any other election coordinated by the county clerk and recorder. Next slide. So now let's look at how that municipal election calendar works in the context of these federal and state mailing requirements. Under charter currently, candidate petitions must be filed 55 days before the municipal general election. This gave us 10 days to verify petition signatures, conduct lot draw to determine the ballot order by which candidate names will appear, lay out and proof the ballot, transmit the ballot to our ballot printing vendor, as well as the vendor that hosts the electronic version of the ballot for our UOCAVA voters. Remember, I mentioned that we have to transmit electronically to UOCAVA voters who choose to get their ballot that way. We then had to proof the vendor's ballots on both platforms and ensure that the ballots were mailed and transmitted by that 45th day. It was a very tight turnaround, and it opened us up to risk of human error when laying out our ballots that might even impact a voter's ability to vote in the races that they're eligible to vote for. It can also, of course, lead to voter confusion if an error is later found, which thankfully has not happened. Military and overseas voter ballots are then mailed or transmitted on that 45th day before the election, and all of our other active voter ballots are mailed on the 22nd day before the election, or as we refer to the countdown, you'll see E- a day, so E-22 or 22 days before the municipal general election. Next slide. Now let's see how the calendar works for the runoff election. In 2019, the municipal general election was held exactly 4 weeks or 28 days before the runoff election. Under charter and state law, voters have 8 days following the election to cure any ballot deficiencies. So if they have a signature discrepancy or they forget to sign or provide ID, we have 8 days after the election to cure.
You should be good to go.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Sorry. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. And then in addition to the 8-day cure deadline, UOCAVA ballots that are returned by mail must be received within that 8-day period. So we can still be receiving cast ballots from UOCAVA voters over that 8 days. For that reason, we do not finish tabulation of all cast ballots in the municipal general election until the 9th day after the election, when the election is officially certified by our canvass board. Next slide. Under the runoff calendar in 2019, we knew on election night that a citywide runoff election was needed, and we were able to identify which candidates were eligible for the runoff election. Our team spent the next day after the election laying out and proofing the runoff ballot. They were able to get the ballot to our vendors by that Thursday, and then approved the proofs from the mailing vendor by that Friday, 25 days before the runoff election. Our ask of our mailing vendor was to be able to print and mail all of our ballots, including our UOCAVA ballots, within 10 days. Remember, we have 420,000 active voters in Denver for this election. So it was printing and mailing 420,000 ballots within a 10-day period of time. That window was so narrow, we actually had to find a new vendor who would be able to accommodate that mailing window, and our vendor was just able to meet that requirement. So our runoff ballots were sent to voters about 2 weeks or on E15 before the runoff election. Obviously, we were not able to meet either the 45-day mailing window requirement under that MOVE Act and updated state law, or even the 8-day requirement under 1303 for our voters. Last year represents the best case scenario for a citywide runoff election. So now let's talk about the worst case scenario, which is also known as our worst nightmare. Next slide. Let's say in a municipal general election, the results in the mayor's race with 3 candidates on the ballot were as follows. Let's say we had candidate A receive 49.95% of the vote, candidate B received 32.05%, and candidate C receiving 18% of the vote. At the end of the night, we know that there are approximately 1,800 curable ballots outstanding in the election, or approximately 1% of the ballots cast. That's pretty typical in an election in Denver, that we have about 1% of our ballots are curable. Voters have that 8-day period to cure their ballot. So presumably candidates would function like our clerk did last year when he was running in a tight race, and would go out and try and encourage voters to get those cures in. So let's see what this scenario could do to our runoff calendar. Next slide. In this scenario, we won't know for sure that a runoff election will be held, because if enough of the curable ballots have votes pushing candidate A above 50%, the runoff would not be needed. The cure deadline falls on E-20 or 20 days before the runoff, and the election would be certified 19 days before the runoff election. It's a given that our team would prepare for this worst case scenario, so we would have ballots laid out and proofed, but we may not want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars printing ballots for an election that might not be needed. So let's say we give final okay to our vendor on E-19 or E-18 days before the runoff to go to print and get our ballots out in the mail. Assuming the vendor cannot print and send ballots any faster, that means our runoff ballots may not be mailed until just 8 days before the runoff election. I also want to point out that USPS currently promises 2 to 5 days to deliver first-class mail. We usually send our ballots out, our large ballot mailing out, when we're sending 22 days before an election at a standard postage rate. We have worked this out with USPS. Under standard postage, that promises a 3 to 10 day delivery. If we were forced, which we would do under this scenario, to send at a first-class postage rate, it would cost us approximately $200,000 more than a typical election to send our ballots. Next slide. Speaking of election costs, it's also worth noting that the municipal runoff election in 2019 cost Denver approximately very nearly $1 million. And that was after the $1 million cost of the municipal general election And as I just noted, you'd add a couple 100,000 to that total if we were running under a worst case scenario. Another cost of the election is voter fatigue. This is of course difficult to assess because many variables impact a voter's decision whether or not to participate in an election. But it's worth noting that participation fell by 21,000 voters in the runoff election last year and by 22,000 voters in the November coordinated election from the municipal general. Some voters do tire of the research needed and inherent pressure they may self-impose on themselves or feel from their peers to make decisions in local elections that often don't have the same media attention or easy access to information. Participation among our UOCAVA voters is also extremely low in local elections, and it was particularly low during our municipal cycle last year. 273 total UOCAVA voters participated in the general election and 260 participated in the runoff. However, in November, turnout actually jumped among those voters to 353. I mean, it's not a huge jump, but it did go up. Likely because those voters are more accustomed to voting in the fall, and their peers who they're working alongside and are likely from other states or counties other than Denver are also voting in the fall in their local elections. So it may feel more expected that they would receive and have a ballot to vote in the fall. Of those who voted in the spring, only 17 voted by mail in May and 10 voted by mail in June. 20 voted by mail in November. Next slide. As the Director of Elections and on behalf of the amazing team here in the Elections Division, we have 3 asks of this committee. First, please consider the impact of moving the candidate filing deadline to enable us more time to prepare ballots ahead of that 45-day UOCAVA mailing window before the general election. As I noted, it's a very tight window and does open risk to human error because of the rushed schedule. Second, please consider the runoff election timeline and particularly that worst case scenario I presented. We strive to be voter friendly and this timeline just is not. This may include considering alternatives to the runoff, such as a plurality or first past the post election, or even an alternative voting method like ranked choice or approval voting. Finally, in the context of voter fatigue and the cost to taxpayers, we also just would ask that you consider whether or not the municipal election should be combined with the November coordinated election to prevent that fatigue and share the cost of the municipal election and ease the burden on taxpayers. As you'll no doubt hear from the demographer in a few moments, Denver has experienced tremendous growth over the last 10 years. In fact, just between 2015 and 2019, we added 70,000 active registered voters to our rolls. At the same time, state and federal laws have expanded access to the ballot and offered more options for voting, but Denver's charter has not been similarly updated to reflect that. We feel these changes should be studied to make our municipal elections more voter-centric, encourage more participation, and ensure they reflect the other elections voters in Denver are eligible to participate in. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so you mentioned curing ballots. What percentage of ballots need to go through the curing process?
Well, we usually have approximately 1% of the ballots cast in an election are curable. Maybe about 0.5% more would be rejected for a reason that's not curable, such as arriving after 7 p.m. on election day. But about 1% of the ballots cast in an election are curable.
Do you feel that's typical?
Yes.
Are you, this is Councilman Flynn, are you watching the raise hand function? I raised my hand to ask her a question. That's probably a good way to sort through this.
I cannot, sorry, I can't see that. I'm going to ask Dan if he can help moderate.
Oh, okay. I'll send an email out with some data requests just to clarify what the problems are and understand how they are what generates them. Denver, until I think either the 91 or the 95 cycle, the spring election was also the school election. School board elections were conducted with the municipal elections every 4 years. And then, of course, every odd cycle after that, they were on their own. And I did an analysis of the turnout going back as long as I could find the records, but there were some cycles for which records were missing. And what I found was that the voting in the school board elections was higher in the spring when it was held in conjunction with the municipal elections. When it was divided and the school elections moved to November, voter participation in general was lower in November and higher in the municipals in the spring. And so it might not always be obvious to conclude that November elections are what people expect. What I found also was in looking at the undervotes, when that data was available, and it wasn't always available in the historical records that you have online. But when I did look at it, in almost all cases, the undervotes, there might have been a higher vote in November in the coordinated election, but mostly it was driven by statewide ballot issues that had received a lot of attention. And when you looked at the undervote in the at-large school board seats, serious drop-off. And so those are the figures you need to look at, not total turnout in November, but who got their ballot in November and just voted on the statewide ballot issue and then left the school board blank. So I think we need a really deep dive on crunching the data on who is voting in what election before we look at moving it to November. Thanks. And I'll follow up with an email.
And then so
Yeah.
I don't seem to have the raised hand, so I'm just going to throw my voice in. But I'd love if you could expand a little bit more on the Uwakova votes. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but you mentioned that there's about 3,500 in the city and about 800 to 900 every year request vote by mail. What do the rest do? Are they not requesting? Are they just not voting? Or can you share a little bit more of the breakdown of those numbers of how that 3,500 is voting?
Yeah, sure. Sorry that wasn't clear. So the rest of our active Uwakava voters are voting electronically. So and when they become a Uwakava voter, they are asked to choose how they want to receive their ballot. So they have the option of receiving it by mail, or they can receive it electronically. We actually still have a fax option as well, but I don't believe we have any voters who've selected fax as their preferred method of receiving. Yeah.
Fair enough. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Looks like we have one more from Blake, and then it looks like that's all the raised hands we have.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I didn't raise my hand before. I didn't realize we were doing that. I prefer it, so thank you for reminding me. One question I forgot to ask, considering curing, it's only 1% of the ballots. Do you have a typical raw total? And what is the cost of curing a ballot? Is it significant?
So the raw total will depend greatly on the election turnout, but 1% is generally a pretty standard number. I don't have the numbers from recent elections at my fingertips right now, but I can certainly provide the committee with that data from both the municipal and 2019 runoff and general and runoff elections, as well as the November coordinated and the 2018 general election, the 2 primaries we've run this year. Any of that data that you'd like to see, I can certainly provide you with. So at a minimum, I'll start with the 2019 municipal cycle data. And then as far as the ability to cure, we actually have made it as easy as possible. Again, going back to our customer service and voter-centric election model, we even make available to voters the option to cure with their mobile device. They can text the word Denver to 28683 or 2VOTE, and they'll receive a link to a secure mobile website on which they can provide their signature and take a photo of the required acceptable form of identification that has to be returned with their signature cure. And so that is by far the preferred way of curing a ballot for our voters who need to cure. I think it was even as high as 80% of the ballots cured in both March and June were cured using that mobile option. Otherwise, they'll receive a letter in the mail as well with an affidavit they can hand complete, sign, provide an acceptable form of ID, and return that either in person. They can return it by email, or they can mail it back to us.
Hi, this is Stephanie O'Malley. I have a question with regards to moving the municipal to November as it relates to voter confusion. Have you done any research on that issue? With the combination of both a municipal and general election at the same time, and if indeed that does cause confusion for the voter?
We have not, no. I think that is the ask of for this committee to consider, and you may, as a committee, choose to consider or not consider that. But yeah, no, I think that is an important piece of our question to answer.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that question, Clerk O'Malley. I think, part of it is, I could tell you that I have anecdotal, evidence of that, but part of the reason why we're convening folks is to analyze all of those, possibilities and to see if we can actually answer some of the whys, right? And one of that is why the May election, why not a November election, or the converse, right? So I could tell you that just having engaged voters since before I was an elected official, that's definitely been a question and a concern. Is I thought elections are in November, right? So, and it just depends on what other area you're in.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's important that we do take up that question as we move along in our discussions and dialogue. I think, it's a very critical one in terms of being fair to the voter. And also, I think it relates to the other issue of voter fatigue, because our ballots are getting longer and longer, or can get longer and longer. And with a combination of two different elections at the same time, I would anticipate that, there'll be instances where, as Councilman mentioned, there'd be undervotes for a lot of different reasons in both of those two elections, whether it be the municipal or the general, because folks will just be getting tired of exercising the franchise on the ballot itself. So I just want us to talk about that as we move along.
Yeah, I will take it.
Okay. And we have a question from Mark Ruskin.
Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you. I'm curious if we will be getting information about alternative voting systems that are used in other cities that are approximately of Denver's size.
I do believe that is a goal and an agenda item for future subsequent meetings. Yes.
Okay, that's helpful. I assumed that it was on a future agenda, but it just seems to me that to the extent that it can be helpful to us and informative to the public, the kind of correlation to the voting populace. And also, I guess I just make an ask now, not only should, if it's available, should we be able to focus on municipalities of a similar size, but also municipalities with voting populaces that have demographic similarity to Denver.
That's definitely the intent. And this first meeting was to kind of just do the introduction to kind of set the tone, and then, you know, for folks to be able to understand the agenda, the schedule, and the questions that are ahead of us. We will dedicate at least some of these meetings to just those questions, right? So we do want to make sure we have those analyses prepared. And also, we also have, you know, I could just say that we also have some of those experts on staff as well too that have done that analysis as well.
That's terrific. Thanks so much.
Yeah, and we're going to be inviting election administrators from jurisdictions as well, so they can give us kind of the perspective of what it was like to administer those type of elections.
We have a question from Councilman Kevin Flynn.
Hello. Turned my camera on because I finished eating my sandwich. Clerk Lopez, do you think that you might need to hire some research capability as opposed to having your staff, which is trying to run this November election, to gather data? Because one of the things, for instance, I like to research, in addition to what Mark just said, is how do jurisdictions that also currently run a runoff system handle the federal responsibility? I noticed it wasn't last cycle, was it 2018 or a special election? Recently, the state of Mississippi had a U.S. Senate election that went to a runoff, and I believe they had the runoff election even less than 4 weeks after the first election. And I'm wondering how they managed to do that. And so it'd be useful to know, how do other places that still use runoff handle these requirements? So do you think you need outside consulting resources to delve into a lot of these questions and get this data for us?
The short of the answer is no. You know, we have, you know, we have a chart in front of you, but we have a lot of our staff who are pretty well-rounded in their studies and their experience coming from other states, looking at some of these other models. One in particular has done our dissertation on this very question as well. So I think, you know, really the ability, I think, for us to be able to do this internally is important for folks to have faith in. We are open to having folks chime in. That's why these are public meetings. We would love to have that kind of testimony. You know, if there are things like that you can point us to, you definitely send us an email. Dan, I think we can repost that in the chat. But given there's a lot of other circumstances there too, Councilman, I mean, given that we are in a budget crunch and we're trying to run this on a very efficient budget, COVID's impact to our budget has been tremendous. And so we're trying to get through this election. But yes, absolutely, we are open to those questions. We are open to those analyses. Will we be hiring folks? That's not in the cards right now because of the budget, unless we see that we absolutely need that help. But I have enough faith in our in the men and women that make up our division in our office to be able to do that as well.
Yeah, Councilman, and I think part of what we were going to talk about in the wrap up too is we really invite all of the committee members to, we're going to have kind of like a research library ready to go for you guys in a little bit. And then if you have any sort of speakers or people that you know of that you want to come in and present to this committee, or if you're curious about something, we can talk about that and start putting those people in and plugging them in for future agendas, so that if you're curious from somebody, or if you know somebody has a really good experience with one of these questions or one of these voting models, you can say, hey, I'd like for them to come in and present to the committee, and we'll set that up. Okay, Andy, do we have any more questions? I also cannot see the raised hand.
I can't see any there.
We currently do not have any other questions currently.
All right. Well then, with that, I am going to transition over and introduce Elizabeth Garner, who is the Colorado State demographer. She has generously agreed to join us today to present on the demographics of Denver. So to expand upon one of the points that Clerk Lopez was making in his introduction, we want to be cognizant of the efficacy of our voters and making sure there's a council that actually does reflect our voters, and possibly not interrupting that if we move to a different type of model. And so we've invited Ms. Garner to come and present to us to talk about how Denver has changed and how Denver might possibly change in the near future. So welcome, Ms. Garner.
Welcome.
Great. Well, thank you guys very much for having me. I'm going to share my screen real quick, pull up some charts for you. Maybe. It says I'm not able quite yet. Can you enable me to share?
Go ahead and try now.
There we go. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Colorado and kind of where Denver fits into it. And again, I can only see a couple of heads, so please stop me if somebody's got a question, but I can't see everybody necessarily. Big piece to take into account maybe moving forward is that Colorado is going to be growing, but at a slower rate out into the future. We've seen this concentrated growth along the I-25 corridor. A lot of that is due to jobs and where the jobs are and where the people are, which has created a really tight labor market, except for right now with COVID. But Colorado definitely had become a little bit less competitive over time. Next big piece to really take a look at is aging, and it affects everything. And even though Denver is one of our youngest counties, we'll definitely see the aging impact in Denver as well. And definitely seeing this increase in race and ethnic diversity. I'm kind of excited to show you a couple of the charts on that for Denver, but definitely some changes there. And this is not really necessarily for this discussion, but it's something to be thinking about, is that migration certainly had become an issue, people concerned about people, the number of people. And so I think that is something that Denver needs to keep an eye on, because it is the kind of the gateway to the state, and perceptions about how we feel about people, I think, is something that's important to keep an eye on. So big picture, and this is what I want you to see, is that we're slowing. The US is slowing, and if the US is slowing, it's going to be likely that Colorado is slowing, but it's still positive. The US increased by 1.5 million, which is a 0.5% annual average growth rate. This is the slowest growth rate since 1918, and 1918 is a year we've been hearing about a lot the last couple of months, because that's when we had the Spanish flu. And this is all pre-COVID changes. So this does not take into account the growth impact by COVID. But we'll probably see in Colorado the slowest growing decade since the in the US, the slowest growing decade since the 1930s. Colorado at the same point is slowing down as well. We're 5.7 million people. It's a 1.2% annual average growth rate. So you can say twice as fast as the US as a whole, but you can also see those other states that are growing there to the south and to the west. Seventh in total growth, increasing by 67,000. So try and remember that number 67. Behind some really big states, but it's important. Perspective is really important. We increased by 67,000. Texas increased by 340,000. So our 67,000 is really small in comparison to some of the other states, but it's definitely the slowest in Colorado since 2005. And this shows Colorado's total change over time since 1970. And you can see on the far right side how we're starting to slow down. The red is net migration. The blue is natural increase, which is births minus deaths. Both downward pressure due to migration as well as natural increase, because we've got fewer births, and an increase in deaths. And again, this is pre-COVID. It's just simply because we're aging that we see that increase in deaths. And so I'd mentioned before that we're seeing this concentrated growth in the population. And I bring this up because really Denver is the center of this, and it's important to see that with Colorado. And I'm sure you're well aware of that. But the red, orange, yellow counties are the counties that are increasing in population. All of the shades of blue are counties that are declining. So even though we're one of the faster growing states, one of the better economies, even with COVID, we've got about 25% of the counties declining in population. So we definitely see this concentration in the Denver metro area in the Front Range. Over time, this last year, between 2018 and 2019, Denver did come up #1 in terms of population growth, increasing by over 10,000. And so if you, again, you remember that 67,000 is how much the total state grew. Denver increased by 10,000 of that, almost 11,000. So a large share of the total state growth actually occurred in Denver. You can look at the other counties, they're in that top list, all in the Front Range. A lot of them Denver metro counties as well. So lots of growth in this concentrated area. I won't go into the percent change ones because that doesn't matter. So if we then look at Denver specifically and we look at those components of population change, this again starts in 1990. The red is net migration, the blue is natural increase, the births minus the deaths. What we can see is that Denver has kind of changed, especially since about 2007-ish time frame, after the recovery of the first recession of the early 2000s. Since about 2006, 2005 forward, Denver has been experiencing, pretty positive net migration to the county. And that is pretty significant because you can see over time where it hasn't always been that case. And so thinking about what causes growth and who tends to migrate and move, really will understand how Denver is changing as well. So again, remember that we've seen a lot of migration recently, which does depart from historical trends. Therefore, when we look at total population in Denver, we can see this pretty significant growth. This chart starts in 85, goes to current. Between kind of 85 and 2005, there was about a 55,000 increase. Between 2005 and 2015, we've seen 100,000 increase. And so definitely this growth at this last part of the decade, fairly significant for the Denver area. So talk a little bit about migration, since I said that that's a pretty big impact to Denver. And what's causing the growth, because we've definitely seen a slowdown in the births. We've seen an increase in the deaths. So it's really the migration that's really creating more of that growth. So for Colorado as a whole, this is the age distribution of those migrants. Definitely concentrated at the young adults. For the state as a whole, 22 to 37 is kind of our bread and butter. A little bit of movement around 65 where this black line is. You can see that little bump. But not a lot in the older age groups. We're not a Florida or Arizona. If we move to Denver, Denver's pretty interesting. We see a very concentrated 20 to 30-year-olds, and that is where we're seeing majority of our growth. So when you saw that migration trend to Denver, it is really very focused at that young adults, those 20 to 30-year-olds. We've got actually a net out migration starting at kind of 32 all the way through the rest of the age spectrum, and they take their kiddos with them. You can see, they might start in Denver, but then they maybe want a bigger home, maybe more yard that they could move into. And so the young adult leaves and they take their kiddo with them, and not a lot of movement around 65 positive into the Denver area. And so that's really important to think about, that it's really young adults. And what drives most of the migration in Colorado, it's really very much job related. As we grow jobs, which you can see in the blue bars, we tend to get a stronger net migration, which is the red line. And I think that's important to understand. Certainly in my position, I'm getting a lot of folks saying, hey, Elizabeth, I'm done with people. I don't want people. I'm like, all right, I'm a demographer. We kind of are into people. So what do we do about it? And I'm like, so what do you think about jobs? And they're like super fans of jobs. Jobs the best. I love jobs. And I'm like, that's really hard conversation, because if you're pro jobs but anti people, just remember a job is a person, and a housing unit's where that job sleeps at night. So we bring those two pieces together. So this is kind of our forecast out in the future, slowing both in the job growth for the Colorado as a whole, as well as net migration out to the future. The bar here at 2020 used to be up at the same level as the 2015 bar for job growth, but with that about 340,000 job loss due to COVID, It's down a little bit, the average for this 2015 to 2020. Likewise, we're expecting migration to slow down as well. But I want to talk about age a little bit because it's really important, and obviously it's really important to elections to understand who is in your population. Colorado's age distribution kind of looks like this, broken down by single year of age. It's color-coded by generation. And so we can see our silent generation, our boomers, our Xers, our millennials, our post-millennials, or Zs, and then the future generation. We can see this slowdown in the youngins. So that's something to take into account, that as we see our potential future voters might be slowing down, or actually they will be slowing down. Our peak birth was in 2007, that makes them 13. So after that, we should start to see a slowdown really in the number of new voters even coming online. We have migration, therefore we've got people here in the middle around the 20 to 30-year-olds. Our peak person is 29. But you can see this, and I want you to see what Denver or Colorado looks like so that then you can look at some other counties. So this is Douglas County, and I throw that in there just for perspective. You can see they've got this peak kind of at the 15-year-old and a peak at a 50-year-old. So you can see their age distribution just for an example. And then this is Denver. This is Denver's age distribution. The black line is at 65. We've got a lot of youngins in Denver. Peak person is 29 as well for the city, county as well. But you can see this pretty significant slowdown. And so the question is, if migration is to continue to slow due to COVID, due to the other trends in the country and in the state, will we start to see this slow down as well? Since again, Denver tends to be the gateway, brings in a lot of those young adults. So what I wanted to show then is kind of our forecast for Denver in that share by age, just to get a little bit of perspective in terms of what's going on. So definitely forecasting a slowdown and a shrinkage probably in that population under the age of 18. So our 0 to 17-year-olds forecast to slow down and even most likely decline in population over time. And this goes out through 2040. Our youngins too in the 18 to 24 also as a share of the total population forecast to slow down, but probably stay about same size total population. We'll see a little bit of slowdown as well, probably in what Denver would consider their bread and butter, their young adults. Again, because we're forecasting migration to slow down. A little bit is competitiveness, a little bit of it is that the whole country is slowing down. Therefore, because those guys are slowing down but aging over time, we're seeing a little bit of increase in the 45 to 64-year-olds and a little bit of increase also in the 65 plus. Denver's not necessarily known for a ton of 65 plus, but again, forecasting to see an increase in that share. So that's something to take into account. Also taking a look at age or diversity by age. So this is for looking at the state as a whole, just to set up this chart. The blue bars are looking at our people of color by age group by share of the total population. So if we look at our under 18 in 2015, 43% were people of color. And that's the way to read this. And about 16% of the 65 plus people of color. The red then is our forecast for 2050. And this again, I'm showing for the state as a whole, 52%, basically all age groups younger than 44, we should start to see a majority of the population people of color. So Denver's interesting. And this shows the age distribution by the different race. It's a different kind of a layout than you just saw. White non-Hispanic population is in this blue, followed by the Hispanic population, which is the orange line. And then we can see the green, which is our black non-Hispanics, and then the red is our Asian non-Hispanics, and then our American Indians. What's very interesting to see is that Hispanic population in our young population, youngest in our teens, is now the largest group, which is very interesting to see. But you'll see a little bit at the very young that where the white non-Hispanic is just a smidge larger. That has to do with a lot of births that are taking place to the folks that are already here. having births and increasing that population at that youngest age. If you go back, this is 2019, if you go back to 2010, almost along every age group, Hispanic, yeah, under the age of probably 15 was a larger age group. But this shows definitely the difference by age and how significant it is, and kind of that break off around 20 to 25, where we're starting to see a larger share of the population, people of color, especially Hispanic. So if we take that information and we just look at the voting age population for Denver, and we look over time, this is kind of the distribution of by race within those different time frames. And so even back in 2010, we had about 40% of the total voting age population were people of color. By 2020, almost, we'll see that it's almost 50% of our total voting age population. Then by 2030, so somewhere between 2020 and 2030, we'll graduate into where we'll see a majority of the population in the voting age population will be people of color. Our forecast for the state is slowing down from our original forecast last year. We were increasing to about 8.1 million. Now that's shrunk down to 7.9 million for the state as a whole, increasing from our current 5.7 million. So that's a 2.2 million, about 1.8 in the Front Range area, 0.9 million in the Denver metro area. And you can see where those other shares are. Our forecast for Denver as a whole is increasing from the current 729,000 to about 884,000. You'll see that it kind of peaks in maybe 2040 and then slows down. I will tell you, we will be slowing this 2030 forecast. This is all pre-COVID. And we know that that's going to have an impact on both deaths, so an increase in deaths, a slowdown in births, and probably a slowdown in migration as well. So we're forecasting this number to be a little bit lower for 2030, but we haven't finished our forecast. We're working on those right now. Obviously really difficult in these times to kind of really get a handle on what that should be. So with that, I will unshare and see maybe what questions you all have for me.
Looks
All right.
like we have a hand raised from Blake.
Yep.
Maybe not.
Go ahead, Councilman Flynn.
Oh, okay. I just a request. Could this presentation be made available to us via email, or is it going to be posted on the website as well? Because I wasn't able to capture all of it, but excellent information. Thank you.
You're welcome, and yes, I will make sure that Andy or Dan have it.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And this is recording too, so we'll post this whole recording on the webpage so we can
Okay.
go back through.
Okay. There we go. It would just be nice to have it so that I could review it at my leisure rather than have to rewatch the meeting.
Okay.
Thanks.
Always good to have your presentations, Elizabeth. Thank you. Always learn something new.
You're quite welcome. Thank you. Did I target anything that you guys are interested in?
Yeah, I actually think the information's fascinating, and I feel like you must have a very, very difficult job to do right now, especially given the pandemic. And then I was actually going to ask how your data possibly relies on the census, if this is kind of relevant at all, or, you know, I know that the census was moving up their deadline when they were going to stop going door to door. So can you talk a little bit about what that might be looking like or impacting your forecasting?
Yep, absolutely. There are, we set all of our new foundations on the census count. So for example, all those numbers for 2019 were based on our 2010 information. So the census is significantly important. Obviously, a huge challenge this decade with COVID happening at the same time, and then having the timing moved up. I definitely think that we have concerns on how reliable the information is going to be. Likewise, there's another side of the census that's coming up. It's called differential privacy. So they're selling it as privacy protection, which I'm 100% in favor of, but at the same time, what we're losing is data reliability and accuracy. So even when it comes down, I mean, fortunately, Denver's a big city and it's great information. And Denver should probably be, for the most part, okay. But if you want neighborhood information, it's going to get less and less reliable, especially by age and by race and gender. And that, I think, I would be concerned about. You've probably seen both the governor and the AG have put out different statements related to how the census is being managed.
Elizabeth, I do have a question. I'm sorry.
No, I'm done. I could go on, but I'm done.
Elizabeth, I think one of the ongoing conversations, and I think one of the things that we were anticipating is a census that was timely. Of course, there's a lot of wrenches in the machine right now to kind of get an accurate count. Now, I'm curious about what we in the elections world look at, especially with minority languages and triggering a 5% threshold for voting rights, Section 203, which is what speaks to minority languages. Do we see, and I think somebody here brought up ballot length as part of voter fatigue, right? And making sure that folks are engaged. But part of the ballot length issues that we have, not issues necessarily, I don't think they're issues, but one of the things that contributes to ballot length is we have to do everything bilingual, as we should, because of that threshold here in Denver that's been met. Obviously, there are other counties throughout Colorado that, it's not just Spanish, but it's also, Southern Ute, and the name, I think in some places where we print ballots in the languages as well. My curiosity is, Elizabeth, do you see an increase in other populations that are minority populations, maybe particularly in Denver also, but just Colorado, other than the folks that are Spanish speaking or Latino Hispanic?
So we do. We have seen an increase. We are getting both kind of the Middle Eastern, North African languages, as well as Asian. So that's coming up in our second. Spanish is significantly larger than any other group in the state, but we are seeing an increase in other languages. There weren't any new geographies that I'm aware of that we're having to change language yet. And I'm still feeling fairly confident about the reliability of the data coming out for language that's coming out of the American Community Survey. They're not going to be changing that for 5 more years, but I know that a lot of people are needing to put into place some backstop technologies or information, because the census data in about 5 more years may not be as reliable.
Yeah, and I think what we're looking for specifically as well, I mean, if we want to all, make sure that we have our eyes on it, is, localities where there are more than, I think if the law is more than 10,000 or 5% of the total voting age population in that political subdivision, right? So it could be township, it could be a municipality, but it's, I think more often than not, it's a county, right? So 5% of voting age residents in that county. So I think where we were close with Vietnamese, right? And when I was a councilman, it was, heavily concentrated in along the southern part of Federal Boulevard in my district, my old district.
Right. I was trying to quickly, while you were talking, pull it up. But I know Vietnamese and Chinese were coming up in the top 5, as well as Arabic, I think was our 5th largest. And maybe I continue to look as there might be some other questions, but it is a question that we get asked every year to pull those numbers for people.
Yeah. And we'll
Yeah,
share
and
with the center.
Sorry, I was just going to add in, I think an interesting part of the conversation would be to talk to some of the folks in Arapahoe County and Aurora as well, for exactly to your point, Paul, there's large Vietnamese and other languages, population spoken out there. And I know that they have ways of navigating that without doing long bilingual ballots. So that would be another interesting conversation we should be sure to bring in. And Elizabeth, if there's a way that we could potentially see kind of that breakdown of the top, languages that we're seeing coming in and out of the city, I think that would be incredibly informative, as we move forward and thinking about access.
Yeah, absolutely. And that might be a tool that we could create, since I'm guessing Denver's not the only place that cares, that's looking at this. That we'll be able to do something like that, a tool so we can easily pull those languages by and make sure I understand legally the geographies that you guys are needing.
I mean, I think right now it's just, language other than English spoken in, home as a determinant, and then the 5% threshold or 10,000.
Okay. Great. Our next question is from Councilman Flynn.
Not really a question. I just want to let everybody know I need to jump off for a meeting at 2:30. So if the meeting goes over, I won't be here any longer, but I will follow up with an email to the clerk. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman.
Well, that's actually a pretty good reflection point, I think. Are there any other hands, Andy, that?
There are no other questions currently.
All right. Well, Ms. Garner, I know that you also have a meeting at 2:30, and so I don't want to take up last one of your minutes. So thank you very much for agreeing to present to us today. We really appreciate it. And this is all really, really awesome information.
Super. And if there's any follow-ups as you go through this process, just hit me up.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. You too. All right. So that moves us along to just the wrap-up items, because we are about 7 minutes before 2:30. Again, we just wanted to broadcast that if we're going to be soliciting public comments throughout the entirety of this process, and that will be going to the specific email that we created for this committee. And again, we will be sure to share every single piece of public comment that we get with all of our committee members before each meeting. And we are trying to keep track of where people are commenting from, so that we can make sure we're getting a good swath of the city, or basically the entirety of the city. So we do ask that if people know their council district, to include that in their public comments, or else we'll do some of the legwork to figure that out. For the next meeting, as you remember, the next one is going to be in September. We are aware, though, that there is a conflict with one of our committee members for 1 to 2:30 p.m. And so we are going to, for committee members, just be looking out, because we're going to be sending out a doodle poll to try and figure out what the next best time is for everybody. It might just be a little bit later in that day, but we would like to try and make it so that all of our committee members can attend. And agendas are going to be posted on the website too, once the dates have been confirmed. So once we just make sure everyone's good, we'll set the dates, we'll put those on the webpage, and we'll have the agendas up as well. Speaking of agendas, the next agenda, or the agenda for the next meeting, is, we'll make sure that the committee members all got public comments, and that there are any questions there, or if there are questions, we'll handle those. And then again, we'll have 2 presentations. So the first presentation is going to be from Doug Chapin, who's a lecturer with the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School for Public Affairs, and he's in the election administration program there. And then we're also going to have a presentation by Tammy Patrick. She's the senior advisor for the elections program at the Democracy Fund. She also is a former election administrator in Maricopa County, Arizona, and she is kind of the USPS guru for all election administrators. And so she'll have a pretty fantastic presentation as well. And then, as you can see at the second to last bullet, committee member discussion. To kind of follow up on what I said to Councilman Flynn, we are absolutely open to having a discussion with committee members if you have resources that you want to share. We are building a little document library for you guys to kind of read up on some of these concepts in the interim. And if you have anything that you think is interesting, if you have a speaker that you think would be really good to present to this group to add a good perspective, we are more than willing to invite those people in to have that discussion. We really want to make sure that this isn't just us throwing information at you, even though that's pretty much the first 2 meetings. I will apologize. It's a lot of information, but we really want this to be a good discussion amongst the committee members. So if you know anyone that you want to present, please let us know, and we'll shoot you an email too in the coming days to remind you.
Dan, we have one question from Megan.
All right, yeah.
Yeah, it's more a comment because Council President Gilmore is one of the folks who can't make this time because she chairs Mile High Flood Control during the same time. But the other comment I was going to make is September 17th. September 16th is the budget hearing kickoff. And so I think quite a few people may have some issues with the 17th. So just wanted to put that out, that the 16th is the first day of budget hearings. So.
Okay. Well, that's a good thing to know. Maybe we'll add a couple new dates in there too before the 16th to try and get it so people aren't too tired. All right. Does anyone, at this point, we'll just open it up for any final comments or questions anyone has before we sign off for the day. All right.